Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the ICA India Forum. I'm very grateful to be able to meet in person with my colleagues this year. Last year I sat on my own on the stage in Liverpool and had to interact with these guys on the screen. So I'm very glad to be here in person with you. My name's Antonia Prescott. I work as Deputy Editor for Cotton Outlook, which many of you will know as the publisher of the Cotlook A Index, and we're also the premier trade journal for the cotton industry. Please allow me to introduce our distinguished guests. First of all, we have Mr. Archan Barua, who joins us from Gill, where he works as commercial lead for cotton in India. Then we have Mr. Sumeet Mittal, who you might remember from last year. Sumeet is head of cotton in India for Louis Dreyfus Corporation. And finally, Mr. Mohit Shah, who surely needs no introduction from me. He's director of Gill Co, of course, and a former ICA president. So if we just begin our discussion by looking at the last 12 months, the period since we last spoke about this topic in Liverpool, it almost goes without saying, but nevertheless, we need to say it. The past year has been another extremely turbulent period for the cotton market. The shifts that have taken place in the macroeconomic environment, as well as the political and social events that we've seen, have all caused huge disruption in prices and, of course, in demand for cotton all over the world. What I'd like to ask you here, first of all, is how have these factors affected India in particular? For instance, what has been the impact of the war in Ukraine? I'm thinking in terms of energy prices, the availability of fertilizer, and then the realizable rates for cotton and competing products, including wheat, for instance, exports of which have been severely affected by the war. Perhaps I can address those first 2 points to you, Mohit. Could you talk about energy and fertilizer?
So, Antonia, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. So on the energy front, India is the world's second largest coal importer, and it imports approximately 80% of its crude oil requirement and 45% of its natural gas demand. Energy prices have always been a perennial challenge for the Indian economy, and the expected impact of the escalation was energy inflation. And thereby, that's also worsening India's balance of payments and increasing our current account deficit. We've seen the Indian rupee devalue by over 10% over the last 1 year. At one point in time, it was so severe that we had even power outages in several states. On the fertilizer front, as prices have risen, India's subsidy burden has also increased. For example, the subsidy on one bag of DAP went up from $20 to $30 over the last 1 year. In addition to the 12.7 US dollar approved by the union government this fiscal, an additional subsidy of $13.3 billion was announced in May 2022. However, India's fertilizer subsidy bill may still overshoot by another $5 billion, crossing $31 billion. I also further want to add that whilst that's a strain on the overall economy of the country and on the exchequer, but the government is very mindful of ensuring that there is enough and adequate availability of fertilizers to the farm sector to maintain farm incomes, as well as national food security.
Yeah. And Archan, can you say something about the supply and prices for wheat this season?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Antonio. Wheat is a little different to fertilizer and energy that we have. India is still a surplus country as far as wheat is concerned. But most of that surplus was built between 2017 2020 when we had some fantastic yields, which was more than what the demand was. The export was subdued because we had a relatively higher MSP. And the wheat was not flowing out of India. The government was the largest buyer. At one point, it was buying 35 million tons against the usual 25 that it buys. So by 2020, India's wheat, ending stocks was close to 30 million. But things changed in 21. We had a unexpected hot period when the wheat crop was about to be harvested. And by the end of that year, our wheat ending stocks was probably down to about 12, 13 million tons. It's still quite above the strategic reserve that we need, about 7.5 million. But then very soon we had the crisis in Ukraine, the global wheat prices shot up, and India started exporting wheat at a much faster pace than what the government anticipated. And I think that forced the hand of the government a bit, in order to curb down the wheat exports. So India had to stop wheat exports, mainly because out of concern of national food security, nothing else. But having said that, wheat export is not banned out of India. The government-to-government business is still going on. India is still open to exporting wheat to vulnerable countries. So that has been the response from the government.
And Sumit, perhaps you'd like to add your thoughts and maybe give us a summary.
Yeah, no, thanks again, Antonio, for the invitation to ICA for this first in-person meeting after COVID. I think Archana and Mohit have covered most points, but I would like to say that having said all this, India has managed the crisis very well, both on the energy front and on the fertilizer front, by getting into long-term contracts and using their astute diplomacy with various governments. The energy crisis in India, for example, is far better managed than some of the neighbors in the Indian subcontinent, and also the European Union. Apart from that, for a long time, India has been investing into other sources of energy like wind power and solar. And so a lot of textile mills and spinning mills have not felt the burden of high energy prices or availability of energy for that matter. So for that one reason, the Indian mills were not shut down or did not reduce consumption. There were other reasons which we can talk about later. And apart from that, on the fertilizer front, I think government recognizes the shortfall or the high import bill that it has to pay on fertilizers.
Yeah.
And over the course of next few months and years, they are introducing various incentives and programs to increase the domestic production of fertilizers. They bought about 20% of their fertilizer supplies recently from Russia at about 15-25% discount to world prices. We saw the growing season for Kharif was not impacted by less availability of fertilizers, so they made sure that does not become a reason for farmers to suffer. And even for the upcoming winter growing season, ample availability of fertilizer has been made.
Okay, thank you. So everybody's favorite topic of the moment, inflation. As inflation has escalated across the world, the result has been, as we know, higher prices and then increased interest rates, which together have limited consumer spending in the major markets of the US, the EU, the UK, and etc., but other markets too. How has that reduction in consumer spending power affected demand for Indian textile products in the local market and also for export? Archan, can I put that to you first?
India is not isolated. So, we know what's the demand expected to be next year. Globally, there's a 4 to 5 million bale cut in consumption. India is a big part of that. So when energy prices are high, when there is a pressure of inflation, the first response of the consumer is to limit his discretionary spending on clothes and textiles. So that was expected. What we have seen in India is most of the European and American retailers, they have slowed down their orders. We didn't see a big flow of order into India for the winter. There has been little cancellation of orders. It's not been huge, but at the same time, there have been some sharp renegotiation of prices. The Indian textile industry is very reliant or very dependent on exports of textile in the form of yarn, fabric, garments. It's been hard for that industry, and then last 4 months has not been easy if you look at it from an export point of view.
Thanks. And Mohit, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so Arshan's covered most on the export front. I would say that the domestic market has been more resilient, though as demand for textile products has held well so far. We've just gone past through one of the largest festive seasons, and the sales have been very robust, and consumers are still spending. India reported the strongest GDP rebound among the G20 countries in 2021. However, there are now concerns as the economy is progressively losing momentum. Real GDP is projected to grow by 6.9% in 2022-23, and with households maintaining a cautious view, we may see deteriorating purchasing power and real flat incomes translating to lower domestic textile demand. I would also say that, the domestic demand just cannot support India's textile industry. Exports are extremely crucial.
Of course. Sumeet, can we take a look back in time to supply in 21-22? What did you make of the Indian balance sheet as it appeared then, and did the market read it correctly?
I think that has been the hot topic of discussion and various debates in forums, not only in India but across the world, to get that Indian production right, because everybody seems to have different figures for the largest cotton producing nation in the world, which is a shame, I would say. But I think India recorded the lowest production in 21-22 over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And this was extremely shocking because the area was not that low. It was mainly because of the yields, which the industry missed. Apart from that, we had a decent carry-in walking into 21-22. So everybody thought that with a higher acreage, there's ample availability of supply. But what most industry missed was the super high consumption levels right after COVID in 2021 and 21-22, right up to April, May of 21-22. So that focus, that single-minded focus on consumption and not on production, I think caught the industry off guard. And again, we have been trying to figure out a reason why the Indian crop has been so severely impacted over the last couple of years. And the conclusion or the semi-conclusion comes down to the adoptability of BT seeds, which have not been improved over a couple of generations. And it's possible that the seed and the fact that we see a lot more late monsoonal rains in September, October, right before the harvest season, has had a double whammy on the crop.
Yeah. I'm going to return to the current season in a moment, but just, Archand, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think there's only one aspect to the balance sheet is that 10% import duty that India had. That did not help. By the time that 10% duty window was waived off, and for the period at which for which it was waived off, it was too less for the Indian mills to import a reasonable amount of quantity in a period of time that would have helped the balance sheet. So for most of the season, the Indian mills operated at relatively high prices. Now they could get through it because the demand was so strong. But I think that added to that difficulty in the tight balance sheet that we had.
So coming back to you, Sumeet, what about the effect of all this market disruption on the spinning sector? How much capacity is in use at present in India?
So the consumption had not really started suffering until May 2022. If we go back in history and look at Indian prices compared to world prices all through the first couple of quarters of 21-22 until about March, April 22, India was reasonably lower compared to Brazilian and US and Aussie prices. So the spinning industry was doing well. The margins were good, they were positive, and we were spinning at close to record capacity utilization. But the biggest impact started happening post-May 2022 when the mills started running out of the stockpiles of inventory. And like Archand mentioned, the 10% import duty that was in place earlier and got removed in April 2022 did not allow the mills to book for the remainder of the summer season. August to October timeframe has been the lowest capacity utilization in a non-COVID year that we would have seen in the Indian industry, with spinning utilization down to 50% or even lower than that. Coupled with the lowest demand and the highest price and the highest basis factor. The yarn export numbers suffered. While India had to buy all this cotton at really high basis levels, whatever was left of it in India and the world, we could see traction of lower demand across the world,
Yeah.
Bangladesh and China and everywhere else. Yarn exports had touched a high of 125, 130,000 tons in a single month. They had gone down to 25,000 tons. That's how severely impacted the yarn export was, which directly impacted the cotton consumption in India.
Of course. Yeah.
So again, now with the new crop harvest beginning, we think that as the prices cool down, as the basis cools down, that momentum will come back, and we would see the utilization levels increase gradually. But we got to see the demand.
So overall, can I ask about the expectations for raw cotton consumption in India in 22-23? Archand, can I pose that question to you?
Yeah, I see. I have a hard time foreseeing why the consumption in 22-23 should be more than 21-22. The first 3 months in this marketing year, we've had the largest shutdown in capacity that at least we know of in recent time, and Sumeet was mentioning 50-60% shutdown. We can't make it up for the balance of the 9 months, and neither do we foresee that we'll get back to the capacity that we saw in January or February of 22. So yeah, I mean, year on year, the consumption is definitely expected to be less. But having said that, I think we are getting out of the difficult period. Consumption from this point forward should increase. Now the expectation for that is, as we see the new crop come in, we are seeing prices, India is trading in an inverted market. We are seeing forward prices lower. So it should help the spinning industries margin, and we expect the mills to start opening up. Mohit mentioned still the domestic demand is decent enough to support it, and I hope there are no more fresh surprises on the macro front. So if things hold here, then yes, we look at consumption improving from here.
I think we all hope that.
I think I will just add a disclaimer over here for the benefit of the audience.
Yes.
Because when we talk about the Indian balance sheet, a lot of people from India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan tend to look at India balance sheet as an October to September balance sheet, which is when the Indian marketing year and crop year is. Whereas USDA and our friends from outside of the subcontinent look at the August-July balance sheet for India. So the August-July that Archand mentioned is going to be lower versus 21-22. But when we look at October to September, that will probably be higher in consumption.
Thank you for clarifying that. So, Mohit, what's the outlook for yarn prices in that case? We've seen a sharp decline since September in particular. Is profitability likely to return in the near term, over the medium term?
So predicting yarn prices is obviously very difficult, especially in this environment. But adding on to what Archand and Sumit mentioned, since May 22, we've seen yarn demand has progressively reduced as Indian mills could not compete globally due to record high prices. And there was just complete lack of suitable availability of cotton domestically as well as in quantity. At the same time, we saw contraction happening whereby exports slowed down. So there was a huge buildup of yarn stocks and sharp capacity utilization. Moving ahead, I would say with the availability of cotton domestically, as a new crop comes in, we're very hopeful. So spinning mills, once they access lower cotton prices, I'm sure margins will improve and capacity utilizations will also come back to some extent. But I think it's not going to be easy, and there are multiple challenges. India, on an average, exports approximately 35% of its yarn production, of which 35% goes to China, and more recently, on an average, 20% to Bangladesh. India will struggle to make up for the reduced imports from these two countries as they face demand slowdown down the chain.
And Sumit, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the margins should get better. I think they cannot remain negative for a long period of time. So I agree that as we see more cotton availability, as the basis comes down, the margins will improve. But we've also seen some structural shifts from cotton yarn, from the peak that we saw in 2020-21. We've seen some structural shift of some spindles move to polyester and viscose. And let's not forget that India is also the second largest producer of polyester in the world. So the polyester industry sees the struggle that the cotton industry has faced. So they are going to ramp up their production of polyester and also of viscose. So there has been some structural shift towards polyester viscose. Some of it will come back to cotton as the prices get more in line. But a lot of it could be a permanent shift as the consumers also start accepting a certain blend of cotton viscose and cotton polyester. There was also a very strong expectation that India will benefit greatly from the movement of retail demand from China to India for the European and the US markets. But I think that India has not capitalized on that aspect very well. It has to do with a number of factors, including labor and skilled labor, to ramp up that production. But a lot of that benefit has gone to countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Vietnam. So I think India as a country, and also the governmental relations in terms of free trade agreements, India will have to pull its socks up. You know, we've been in talks with the UK government on a free trade agreement, and if that goes through, that's going to add a great deal to the end user export demand out of India. However, the slowdown in the US perception of the US economy, certainly the European economy and the tight controls on the Chinese COVID policy can have a great impact on the consumption in general across the world, not only India, but India will not be the one to not suffer it. So it will also get impacted. So in the short and the medium term, the demand needs to really come back in cotton. And we've seen prices do some of the rationing over the last 2-3 weeks in these high volatile environments. So we need to see the demand overall come back for Indian cotton.
Thank you.
And Antonio, just adding on to what Sumit said,
Of
you know, just a point on capacity utilizations and yarn prices. As you know, India is a large country, and you know we have you know, spinning installed in various states.
Of course, yeah.
So it's always possible that you have yarn margins coming back quickly in one state compared to the other, just given, you know, the internal cost structure.
Yes. Yeah, thank
Absolutely.
you. So we promised to turn to production in this current season. What are the prospects for this year's crop? Last year, as we observed, the disappointing yields that only made themselves clear as arrivals in November and December failed to reach the typical peak. We know that this season has again been very wet, but waterlogging doesn't seem to have been so much of an issue as it was in the last season. What are your expectations for output? Mohit, perhaps I can ask you first.
So I would say, Antonia, that we are very hopeful on a larger Indian crop this season. After, you know, I would say 2 or 3 very disappointing seasons, unless we get this terribly wrong. I don't know. So we have approximately a 7% higher acreage, between 12.8 to 13 million hectares. We've seen very good growing conditions. The rains have been very spread out, and the standing crop at this point in time looks good across most states. The quality also seems to be pretty promising from what we've seen on the early arrivals.
I think before talking about 22-23, we should give an estimate of what 21-22 crop really was. And again, the estimates range between 22.5 to 24.5 million bales, 480 pounds, of course. So if we just take a midpoint of that, call it 23.5 million bales, 480s or around 30 million bales, 170s was the production for 21-22, which is what I think most trade estimates are, apart from USDA, which is a little bit higher today. With the growing conditions that we have seen, and the acreage increase across India closer to 13 million hectares, the lack of the high rainfall in the month of October and September compared to last year, you know, I think we can be a little bit optimistic about the crop for 22-23, and it would not be outlandish to say that we can produce a 28.5 million bale 480s crop, which would be roughly around 36 million bales 170s. I think one of the structural shifts that has happened in the Indian farming sector, in cotton in particular, that farmers have started going for the second crop in the winter season more than what they used to do in the past, because that just helps protect their soil better,
Yes.
reduces the crop infestation in the next year. So there's a portion of the crop which we call as further, or the further crop, because Indian crop is all manually harvested, so they can take multiple picks. The farmers, if there is good water availability, they leave the crop standing. And especially if the prices are good, they will go for that second cotton crop
Yes.
instead of uprooting it and planting a winter crop. So prices over the next couple of months, what farmers realize at the farm gate level, coupled with how good the main crop yields are,
Yeah.
can easily add or reduce 1.5, 2 million bales to the Indian crop in the end.
But Archan, I think you've got a point to make about seeds.
Yeah, but before I get to the seed, what I would say is the early crop that we see now is excellent quality.
Good.
We have a good grade and the parameters are holding up. And generally a good grade is an indication of a good healthy crop. So I think it adds to what Mohit and Sumit were saying. We are all hopeful of a good Indian crop. But as you said, I think the dark factor or the unknown still remains the seed. Last year at this time, we were all expecting a 36, 37 million bale Indian crop, and it ended up almost 5-6 million bales less. We had the same perfect growing conditions, no major pest infestation, and I think we have all scratched our heads throughout the year as to explain why the crop has been so poor last year. And the only thing which we cannot pinpoint, but I think it points to direction, is the seed.
Yeah.
Because every other external factor seems to be was perfect as required. So we'll get to see this season if the same good growing condition, we end up with a good crop, then maybe the last year was an aberration. But if the crop turns out to be another disappointing crop, I think it strengthens our conviction that there is something wrong with the seed.
So that brings me to my next question. Over the longer term, what are the prospects for output? We know that over the last decade, Indian yields have declined substantially. We also know that there's a great focus on this now from the government. The Commerce Minister, who also has textiles in his portfolio, has established a textiles advisory group. Do they have a plan to address this? Mohit?
Well, Antonia, the Indian crop is always subject to big swings because it's vulnerable to being exposed to changing weather patterns, pest attacks, lack of new seed technology, and a large portion of the acreage being rain-fed and under small fragmented farms. India is probably the only country in the world where we've seen trend yields going down over the last few years. Long term, the growth has to come from improved yields. I mean, that's the only way. Indian acreage has been around 12 to 13 million hectares over the past decade or so. And I think from here it's going to get very hard to gain acres from pulses, food and feed grains, especially as the government gives high priority to food security. So I would say a million hectares is probably a 7% increase from here. India also has one of the lowest yields in the world, therefore, well, has the potential to grow the most.
Sure.
If I take an optimistic picture, and I would like to be optimist and a pessimist, on similar acreages in the past, India has produced over 31 million bales. So, with the right seed, better farm practices, I think India can produce 38 million bales, although, this may look very far-fetched from where we are today, but I think longer term, it's achievable. And I think I think market forces will make that happen eventually. I mean, whether it's from new seeds or whether, change of mind in the government in terms of the current approach.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, with the focus on the textile industry by the government, we can't be in a situation where we have, this constant, very erratic production, what we have seen on one hand, versus the government's aim to ensure that the textile industry thrives and grows So I think they are mindful of that, and moving ahead, I think it's going to be positive.
Good. Sumeet, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, but before addressing this point, I just wanted to mention another point on the previous question about the crop forecast for 22-23. When we were going to the Australia and the Brazil forums, I was amazed to see how today they can predict with a good degree of accuracy crops for not only this year but the next couple of years. India has a long way to go before even we can predict this year's crop after the crop has happened.
Yeah.
We continue having those debates, right? I mean, but the bigger challenge is that with the farm sizes in India being so small, the average farm size being about 2 hectares, having about 6 million cotton farmers versus Brazil a few hundreds, Australia maybe a few thousands of cotton farmers. So technology will have to play a crucial role in India, because getting that Indian crop estimate within a 3 to 4% range in the beginning of the crop year is very important for the cotton industry as a whole to understand, because India can cause severe disruptions in the world prices of cotton market. If it produces a 50 million bale 170s crop like Mohit mentioned, it has the ability to produce 38 million bales 480s. We've seen it in the past achieve 33, 34 million bales in 16, 17, 17, 18. So the potential is there. It's just that it's not being utilized fully. The government also, so now coming to your question about long-term forecasts, I think the government realizes now that long-term, on a longer-term basis, if the cotton production is not addressed, India stands to lose its competitiveness, both on the cotton export front and the yarn and the finished garment export front to all the other competing nations. The industry is forecasted to grow about 4 to 5%. The GDP is growing, population is growing, disposable income in India is growing. So the Indian domestic demand for cotton and its products is also going to grow. So we cannot, as a nation, afford to run out of cotton. And that has been our inherent advantage today over competing countries over a long time, because we've had a huge exportable surplus for a long time. Over the last 1 year, we've attended several meetings with stakeholders in the government and outside. They have formed a textile advisory group which has a larger mandate, but the primary focus remains to address the quantum and the quality of cotton production. Introduction of new technology is the way to go forward to improve yields. Recently, we saw that government has approved GM for mustard, and this is a first in the edible oil space. The government understands that the huge import bills that it pays on edible oil is not going to be affordable much longer. So I don't think there is any other option but to introduce GM into the edible oil space in a 5 to 10 year horizon. And if that happens, then cotton tends to lose acreage, because as the production of beans and other oilseeds increases, the profitability to the farmers will also increase.
Of course,
And if the cotton yield is not addressed, then the acreage will shift towards the more yielding crop and a more profitable crop. So I think some of us mentioned earlier that this 13 million hectare looks to be kind of the peak as far as cotton acreage can go. And it can reduce towards 10 million hectares, maybe lower, if other crops start doing better on the yield front. So technology is the way to go forward. We will have to address the issue of pricing as well to the company that introduces the better technology seeds. And it's the same government that first introduced BT cotton back in 2002, 2003, about 20 years ago, when we had this huge revolution in India of increasing yields, and then it becoming a net surplus and a net exporter from a net importer.
Sure.
So I remain cautiously optimistic that these issues will be addressed.
And picking up on that point about the trade balance, in your view, will the country remain a net exporter in the near term? Just what are the views on Indian imports from here on? Can India become a larger exporter, or are imports going to grow faster than exports? Archan, perhaps I can ask you.
So if you look at the last decade and a half, I think the peak of exports was about 11 million bales, and the largest that we imported was about 3 million. But if we look in the recent past, I think the domestic industry has ramped up the consumption because we have the inherent advantage of having the crop at our back door. So the exportable surplus is now about 3.5 million bales. Now going forward, whether export increases or import increases, there's one important factor or that. I would try to answer this assuming that we have a free trade economy. There are no government interventions or there are no other restrictions. What we can definitely foresee is that the consumption growing, and it will initially be in the form of yarn, which is what India exports mainly. But as Sumeet was mentioning, there is the shift of retail demand happening away from China. Now, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, they have been able to capture the first mover advantage, but I think there is a realization within the Indian industry that we need to catch up. There are some, I would say there is some active planning and things going in the back end where the government is also trying to revisit the agreements that we have with Europe and US. So if those things happen over the next 4 to 5 years, consumption will definitely increase. Now, if India can produce 35 million, 36 million bales, then yes, the Indian exportable surplus increases. But if we get stuck at this 30, 32 million type of number because of seed or whatever it is, then I don't think the exportable surplus grows. Then India tends to become a major importer going forward.
And so on that point then, what are your thoughts on the 10% import duty in India? I mean, the extension of the duty waiver has just come to an end at the close of October. Despite representations from the industry, the waiver has not been renewed. Archan, what do you make of that?
It's been tough for the industry to operate with this 10%. The gap in the S&D was, identified in March or maybe a little earlier by most of us. But the Indian mills could not import because we had a 10% duty. Sure. Now, by the time the duty waiver was announced, and for the window at which it was announced, there wasn't sufficient time for India to import in time. We know, the logistical problem that the industry has gone over the last 12 to 18 months. We still have a lot of cotton that hasn't arrived in India, and that's another issue that the industry will have to sit and sort it out. So yeah, that 10% import duty I thought was tough on the industry. I can see why the government did it. It was to protect the farmers about 12 months ago. But if you look at India's import, India is not a very big structural importer. If you say a million bale is more or less the Indian imports, 40%, 50% of it is because of quality, certain machine-picked cotton programs that the mills have to run, and that's always going to be there. The balance, let's say 500,000 bale is what India imports to fill the gaps in the S&D. It really does not impact the farmers when you talk about a 32, 33 million bale crop. The farmers have their MSP protection. The government really participates very strongly when the prices hit MSP. After wheat and rice, cotton is the third most supported crop in terms of MSP. So, by this 10% import duty, what it has done is in the short term, it made very difficult for the Indian mills to compete with its neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Vietnam. But if it continues like this, my main concern is around that. If these types of, I think, interventions happen, overall it makes the industry uncompetitive. It kind of questions the viability of the whole industry. So yeah, I think this 10% import duty is something that the industry needs to sit together and probably has to, get out of it as soon as possible.
Is that your view as well, Mohit?
Yeah, well, I agree with all what Archan has said. Adding on to the import duty currently in force, is a clear example of how our textile industry struggled to operate through this scenario of limited supply, where your production was just so low, and coupled with all the extended delivery periods and logistical uncertainties which we witnessed over the last 6-8 months, when mills are already losing 20-25% margins on yarn, all the imports landing just even a week to 3 weeks later will hit them by additional 10%. I would say definitely that the 10% import duty is an unwelcome step, and the government must consider withdrawing the duty. Sumit mentioned earlier that there have been multiple representations that have been made to the government, and the dialogue is ongoing at various levels. We hope the government realizes that this policy is leading to loss of market share for the textile industry, and it's definitely creating a long-term vulnerability to the industry.
I want to address the same question to you, Sumit. Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen that the industry has flourished only when the trade has been completely free, whether it's from the export side and the import side. In 2010, 11, 12, we had these huge export controls on Indian cotton, and that not only impacted the Indian industry, but it was a catalyst to send the global industry in turmoil. When we saw the prices go to $2.50, India had banned cotton exports, and the world wanted cotton. So we've seen time and again that trade controls, especially on cotton, has had negative impacts. Exports haven't been touched over the last 10 years, which is a welcome step. But having a 10% import duty completely disadvantages Indian mills. Because, like Archana and Mohit both mentioned, India imports only, 1 to 3 million bales. That's not even 10% of India's consumption. So that goes into specialty cottons, into Pima, into Gies, and into machine-picked US and Australian. And on top of 10% import duty, you not only compete with the additional cost, you have other countries which have more preferred nation status with Europe and US. So it's a double impact. It's almost a 20% impact, so much so that this entire demand of contamination-free cottons and the ELS can shift to the neighbors.
Sure.
So I hope that the government recognizes this, the loss of revenue to the government, and it's kind of ironic that at a time when India is removing import duties on edible oils, which used to be one of its biggest payments, it has imposed import duty on cotton, which is a very, very small importer of cotton. So I hope, and we are working towards it to make sure that there's a level playing field across the industry.
More work for the Textiles Advisory Group to do, I think.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that concludes the prepared section of our discussion. I think we do have a few minutes for additional questions, if they want to come up on the screen. Actually, I'll start off with one, because we were just mentioning before about the state of the crop, and it looks good. But in your view, I'm tracking arrivals, and normally what we expect to see is a step change in the pace after Diwali, which this year was the 24th of October. I have not detected that increase in pace so far. Am I wrong? Am I looking at the right sources?
Is the question to me?
So anyway, I'll throw it out there.
No, you're not wrong, but I would not read it as an early sign to a smaller crop. We need to give due to the farmer. Last season, he was getting like 12,000 Indian rupees per quintal, and now he's barely getting 10. It will take some time for the feeling to sink in for the farmers.
Right.
And I think they are smart enough. They realize, and they'll take their time to come to the market.
There is currently a bit of holdback.
Okay.
Like Archan mentioned, I think in the weeks ahead you'll see the arrivals, the pace of arrivals increase.
Yeah, I think the farmers did see a higher price later in the season last year, but in the beginning of the season, between November through Jan, Feb, the prices were not as high. They were around similar levels. Obviously, everyone has a recency bias on the prices they got, and that's the aspiration to get those prices. But sooner or later, I think farmers are also looking at, or at least hearing about, the poor textile demand and the poor economic conditions across the world. So prices are one factor. A late planting season could be another, especially in the central region of Maharashtra and southern region. So, I would not be too much concerned about the current pace of arrivals. I think it's just 15, 20 days delayed.
Okay, so we've got a question about MSP prices and the activities of CCI. And obviously in the last season, that the MSP didn't really factor wasn't a market factor, and CCI didn't make any purchases. But the question is, do we forecast CCI buying? Is this likely in the current season? What do we think? Depends on the crop.
Okay, I'll go first. If you look at the MSP equivalent, now there are a lot of factors which goes into determining the MSP. We have a seed price, there is an element of Indian foreign exchange, but let's assume everything is kind of in and around where it is during the season. So the MSP range is between 80 to 85 cents landed Far East. If you have a New York which is at these levels, I don't foresee MSP as a problem. Now, we don't see the demand of Indian cotton as yet because the big buyers of India, which is Bangladesh and China, they haven't yet started importing Indian. But if New York holds here and the Indian price, which is expected to come down, it kind of levels up, I think Indian exports will happen. And then unless we have again a 36-37 million bale crop, I don't foresee MSP to be a major issue this year. It will happen in some pockets, maybe momentarily, especially down south where the seed prices are low. But right now, I can't see a big MSP program happening.
Yeah, the theoretical MSP range, I think it's very, very dynamic because it depends upon a lot of factors like ginning outturn,
Yes.
seed prices, currency. Because remember that in the Indian MSP program, the government does not buy cotton bales. It buys seed cotton, gets it ginned, then sells the seed in the market.
Yeah.
So seed prices play a huge impact whether the MSP break-even could be 75 cents or 90 cents a pound.
Sure.
That's one. Two, I think the bigger issue of India going to MSP is not an Indian production question, but it's a world supply-demand question. We are seeing the US balance sheet as being forecasted to be one of the tightest at this point of the year. So the question really is whether the world needs or whether the US needs to make those export sales and push India into MSP. I don't see that happening today. And if that were to be the case, then yes, if the prices do go down towards 70 cents, we can see government becoming active and getting into an MSP buying program. As the prices keep going lower, between 70 cents to 60 cents, the MSP buying would increase because the basis, Indian basis Far East, goes more, becomes higher and higher.
What question here? Oh,
I
sorry.
would just like to add on this, but it's not on the MSP, but
Yeah.
CCI for
Yes, of
sure.
course.
I do agree with Archan and Sumit on what they've said on the MSP. I think the surprise element with CCI could be if they decide to step in and start commercial operations and go in and probably buy a few million bales. I mean, that could very well happen this season. And that's something we need to watch out for.
Oh, we'll pay attention. There's a question here. Please say something about organic certification this year. Last year, Bangladesh suffered a lot. I'm not sure in exactly what context they're talking about suffering, but organic certification across the board. Anybody would like to volunteer to address that?
I don't know exactly what that question means or who it is directed to, but I think one word of advice to the buyers would be to be absolutely sure who you are buying from and to ensure that you get the entire documentation that is needed, whether it's organic or BCI. Again, like I said, India is a big market with more than 6 million farmers, thousands of ginners, traders, so you have to be very cautious who you trade with so that you get the right documentation.
Of course, yeah, be careful.
I would also say that there has been some action currently being taken on certain suppliers getting suspended from the, organic side of the registration process, pending certain clarifications and certain inquiries. So I would agree with what Sumit said.
Sure. So we have another slightly challenging question. If the government has an MSP policy, why not also have the import duty? You're going to say, if it's a true free market, you're not going to have any subsidies, you're not going to have any support programs. Do we need a completely flat
Yeah, having the
trading
MSP
environment?
policy and the import duty on top of that is again a double whammy for the mills. Because when you have the MSP, you're protecting the farmers by giving them a fair average price, and government is absorbing that surplus. Because remember, Indian farmers are not rich. When the crop is made, they need to sell because for their daily incomes. Now, the MSP program is put in place so that sudden shocks in world prices can lead to Indian farmers selling below their cost of production. So government wants to ensure that they get a reasonable price and over their cost of production, and they take the pressure of that cotton. But then if you also have an import duty, what that means is while you're protecting the farmers, you're also penalizing the industry, mill industry, that cannot have access to cheaper import cotton that other countries can. So in fact, having an MSP program and a free import policy should go hand in hand. So that at one step when you're protecting the farmers, the mill industry is also protected by allowing them access to cheap, or not cheap, but fair market price import cotton.
Thank you. I'll just take the last question now. Any developments with regards to the use of local currency for bilateral trade with export countries such as Bangladesh? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
So I think, yes, I mean, there is consideration on that, and I think both governments are actively discussing, and I think that can become a reality. I think all the details are currently being worked out, and I don't think it's only limited to Bangladesh. I think several countries are under consideration to trade in, to bilaterally in the local currencies. So yes, this does have a future, but I'm sure the amounts are kind of going to be capped, and one of the ongoing debates from what I've understood is the settlement mechanism and the time frame of settlement of such bilateral trade. So it's surely a possibility.
Okay, well, there we are, concluding exactly on time, I think. So thank you very much indeed for your expertise, for your time, and generously offering your opinions on the state of the market. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.